The spiritual identity often dies later because it is one of the last identities a person suspects. It can feel too refined to be a mask, too meaningful to be an ego structure, too connected to truth to ever become a limitation. A person can release old ambitions, old relationship patterns, old social roles, and still quietly rebuild the same need for identity inside spiritual language. The words change, the costume changes, the center remains familiar. This is why the death of the spiritual identity can be one of the most delicate thresholds in a person's becoming. At first, the spiritual identity may be necessary. It gives language to experiences that ordinary life could not explain. It helps a person leave behind dead patterns, recognize deeper perception, and find meaning in events that once seemed random or cruel. For many people, the seeker identity is not false in the beginning. It is a bridge. The problem begins when the bridge becomes a home, and the person forgets that a bridge exists to be crossed. You may notice this when the language that once opened you begins to harden around you. Words like awakening, healing, mission, alignment, energy, intuition, and purpose can begin as doorways. They help you name what was invisible. But over time, they can become walls if they start protecting you from ordinary honesty. A spiritual identity becomes dangerous when it allows a person to sound awake while avoiding the simplest truth directly in front of them. The mechanism is subtle because spiritual identity does not usually feel like performance from the inside. It feels like commitment, sensitivity, devotion, or discernment. A person may truly care about growth and still become attached to being someone who is growing. They might truly value truth and still become attached to being seen as someone who carries truth. They may truly want to heal and still become attached to the story of being a healer. The attachment is not always loud, but it begins shaping how the person speaks, chooses, relates, and protects themselves from being ordinary. This is where the death begins. Not when spirituality disappears, but when the identity built around spirituality starts losing its grip. The person may still feel connected to depth, but the old labels begin to feel too tight. Seeker, healer, light worker, chosen one, guide, old soul, awakened one, star seed, mystic, teacher. These names may have served a season, and some may still carry symbolic meaning. But when the deeper self begins to mature, it no longer wants the name to do the work that only lived integrity can do. A spiritual label can become a shortcut to significance. It can make a person feel important before they have become honest. It can make them feel advanced before they have become grounded. It can make them feel separate from others in a way that feels sacred but is actually lonely. This does not mean every spiritual label is false. It means any label can become a hiding place if it starts giving you identity faster than your life can embody it. The experience of this death is often quieter than people expect. It may begin as a loss of excitement around spiritual language. You still understand the words, but they no longer give you the same charge. You may stop wanting to announce what you are, explain where you come from, or prove how much you perceive. Something in you becomes tired of carrying a special self. At first, this tiredness may feel like disconnection, but it may actually be the beginning of humility. Humility here does not mean shrinking yourself or denying what is real in your experience. It means no longer needing your depth to become an identity display. You can still perceive deeply without turning perception into superiority. You can still care about healing without needing to be recognized as a healer. You can still walk a spiritual path without turning the path into a personal brand. That shift may look simple from the outside, but inside it can feel like losing the very language that once held your life together. This is why some people panic when the spiritual identity begins to die. They think they are losing faith, losing connection, or falling backward into ordinary consciousness. But sometimes what is dying is not the connection. What is dying is the need to use the connection as proof of who you are. There is a great difference between losing depth and losing the identity that wanted depth to make you special. One is collapse, the other is maturation. You can see this distinction in how a person responds when they are not recognized. If the spiritual identity is still hungry, lack of recognition feels like erasure. The person may become defensive, preach harder, signal more, or withdraw into the belief that others simply cannot understand them. But when the identity begins dissolving, something more stable appears. The person no longer needs every room to confirm their depth. They can carry what is real without demanding that it be seen immediately. This changes relationships because spiritual identity often creates hidden distance. A person may believe they are relating with compassion while secretly evaluating everyone through levels, awareness, vibration, or readiness. They may listen, but only from the role of one who knows. They may offer insight, but not always from true presence. When the spiritual identity begins to die, these subtle hierarchies become harder to maintain. The person starts seeing that some of what they call discernment was actually defense with luminous language around it. That realization can sting because the spiritual self often believes it is the most sincere self. And sometimes it is sincere. But sincerity does not prevent distortion. You can sincerely want to help and still use helping to avoid your own need. You can sincerely want truth and still use truth to stay above vulnerability. You can sincerely believe you are guided and still confuse guidance with the part of you that wants certainty. The death of the spiritual identity brings these distinctions closer to the body, where they can no longer remain abstract. One of the deepest layers of this death is the release of being chosen. The chosen identity is powerful because it gives suffering a grand explanation. It turns isolation into assignment, sensitivity into evidence, and hardship into proof of special design. For a time, that story may help a person survive. It can make pain feel meaningful instead of random. But if the chosen identity never matures, it can trap the person inside a role where they are always exceptional, always misunderstood, always carrying something others cannot see. The spiral does not have to erase the possibility of purpose in order to dissolve the chosen identity. It simply reveals that purpose does not need inflation to be real. A person can be deeply called without being superior. They can be meaningfully shaped without being separate from everyone else. They can carry unusual perception without using it to escape ordinary responsibility. This is one of the most important shifts in spiritual maturity. Purpose becomes quieter, not weaker. When the spiritual identity dies, the person may start returning to simple human experiences with new honesty. Eating, working, resting, apologizing, listening, cleaning, grieving, earning, waiting, and caring for the body all become part of the path again. Not because spirituality was false, but because spirituality that cannot enter ordinary life remains incomplete. The death of the spiritual identity brings the sacred back down into the everyday. It stops using height as proof of truth and begins measuring truth by how it lives. This is where the seeker identity also changes. Seeking has its place. It opens the mind, breaks inherited certainty, and teaches a person to ask better questions. But seeking can become a way of never arriving anywhere long enough to be changed. Some people keep searching because stillness will reveal what they are avoiding. They move from teaching to teaching, system to system, sign to sign, always collecting more language while the same wound remains untouched beneath it all. The death of the seeker identity does not end inquiry. It ends the addiction to endless inquiry as a substitute for embodiment. A person may then discover that the next step is not more information. It may be obedience to what they already know. It may be practicing the boundary they have explained for years. It may be forgiving what they have analyzed from every angle. It may be living simply, consistently, and honestly without needing every action to feel spiritually charged. This can feel underwhelming at first because the spiritual identity often prefers revelation to repetition. But much of real transformation happens through repetition that no longer entertains the ego. The healer identity must also pass through this fire. Helping others can be beautiful, but it can also become a place to hide from being helped. Some people learn to carry everyone else's pain because it gives them purpose, control, and belonging. They become skilled at reading the room, sensing what others need, and offering comfort. Yet beneath the gift, there may be a quiet fear that if they stop healing others, they will no longer know why they are here. When that identity begins to die, the person must learn that love is not the same as self-erasure. The death of the healer identity does not make someone cold. It makes their care cleaner. They stop trying to rescue people from lessons that belong to them. They stop confusing availability with compassion. They stop using other people's crisis to confirm their usefulness. This is not withdrawal from service. It is the purification of service, because now the help no longer has to prove the helper. Care becomes less dramatic, less controlling, and more honest. And then there is the fear of nihilism. Many people secretly believe that if the spiritual identity dissolves, meaning itself will disappear. They worry that without the grand role, the mission, the special language, the cosmic explanation, life will collapse into emptiness. But the opposite often begins to reveal itself. When the inflated identity loosens, meaning becomes less performative and more intimate. It returns in smaller forms, but those smaller forms carry a truth the old identity often missed. Meaning may appear in keeping a promise, in telling the truth without decoration, in staying present with someone without needing to teach them, in doing the work that needs to be done without turning it into a symbol. This kind of meaning can feel plain at first, but plain does not mean shallow. Sometimes plainness is what remains when false elevation burns away. The death of the spiritual identity does not remove the sacred from life. It removes the need to constantly announce it. And that opens a different kind of depth that does not need to perform itself before it can be trusted. Once the spiritual identity begins to loosen, the person often enters a strange middle place where they no longer want to perform spirituality, but they also do not want to abandon what is true. This is an important distinction. The death of the spiritual identity is not a rejection of depth, guidance, or unseen meaning. It is the removal of the personal costume that formed around them. What remains can feel plain at first because the ego was used to feeling charged by its own specialness. This plainness can be misunderstood as emptiness. A person may miss the intensity of earlier awakening seasons, the signs that seemed constant, the teachings that felt electric, the inner confirmations that made every moment feel arranged. But not every reduction in intensity is a loss of connection. Sometimes intensity fades because the system no longer needs drama to recognize truth. A mature path becomes less obsessed with signs and more faithful to alignment, even when alignment arrives quietly. This is where spiritual maturity often becomes less entertaining to the old self. The old spiritual identity loved thresholds, downloads, breakthroughs, synchronicities, revelations, and moments of being dramatically confirmed by the universe. These moments may happen, and they can be real, but they are not the foundation. If a person needs constant intensity to believe they are connected, that connection is still being measured through stimulation. The deeper movement asks whether truth can still be honored when it does not excite the identity. A simple example is the difference between receiving insight and living by it. Receiving insight can feel beautiful because it gives the mind a sense of expansion. Living by insight is slower because it asks the body, habits, relationships, and choices to change. The spiritual identity often prefers the moment of seeing to the discipline of becoming. When the identity dies, a person begins to realize that revelation without embodiment can become another form of consumption. They may have been feeding on insight while avoiding the ordinary transformation the insight required. This is why the death of the spiritual identity can bring a person back to accountability. Not punishment, not shame, but accountability. The question becomes less about what you know and more about what your knowing has changed. Has your sensitivity made you more honest or only more reactive? Has your intuition made you clearer or only more certain? Has your healing language made you more available to truth or only more skilled at explaining your patterns? These questions matter because spiritual language can easily outrun spiritual integration. A person can describe shadow work while still avoiding apology. They can speak of compassion while refusing to listen. They can talk about alignment while abandoning commitments whenever discomfort appears. They can name trauma, energy, soul contracts, or divine timing while never confronting the very human behavior that keeps repeating. The death of the spiritual identity brings the path back into the body, where words have to become conduct. This is also where the spiritual self loses its ability to use distance as proof of advancement. Earlier in the path, separation can feel necessary because a person can truly need to leave environments, beliefs, and relationships that suppress their growth. But later, separation can become a habit, and the person may begin mistaking avoidance for discernment. They may call everyone draining because closeness exposes them. They may call every challenge misalignment because difficulty threatens the identity of being guided. What began as protection can become isolation wrapped in sacred language. A more grounded spirituality does not require constant separation from ordinary life. It can sit in the room without needing to dominate the room. It can listen without converting every conversation into a teaching. It can sense what is happening without needing to announce it. This kind of presence has less spectacle but more strength. It does not disappear when no one recognizes it, because it is no longer built around being recognized. The implication is large because many people do not actually fear losing spirituality. They fear losing the identity that made spirituality feel like proof they mattered. If the chosen one role dissolves, who are they without a cosmic explanation for their pain? If the healer role dissolves, who are they when they are not needed? If the seeker role dissolves, who are they when they are not chasing the next teaching? These questions are not meant to humiliate the person. They're meant to reveal where meaning has been attached to role instead of rooted in being. When the chosen identity softens, purpose does not vanish. It becomes less theatrical. The person may still feel guided, still feel shaped by deeper patterns, still recognize that their life carries meaning beyond surface events. But they stop needing that meaning to separate them from others. They stop needing a special title to protect them from ordinary vulnerability. Their purpose becomes less about being exceptional and more about being precise, faithful, and clean in how they live. When the healer identity softens, compassion does not vanish. It becomes less entangled. The person still cares, but they no longer enter every room looking for who needs saving. They no longer confuse emotional access with responsibility. They begin understanding that some people must meet their own lessons without being carried through them. This is not coldness, it is respect, because true compassion does not always interfere with another soul's necessary encounter with itself. When the seeker identity softens, curiosity does not vanish. It becomes more rooted. The person may still study, question, explore, and expand, but they are no longer using movement to avoid stillness. They can stay with one truth long enough for it to alter behavior. They can let knowledge descend into practice instead of collecting more and more language to avoid the pressure of what has already been seen. This is where seeking matures into devotion. Not devotion to an ideology, but devotion to honest embodiment. This is a major turning point because the spiritual identity often survives through endless becoming. There is always another level, another activation, another upgrade, another hidden truth, another sign that something greater is coming. That sense of becoming can be alive and valid, but it can also become a way of never being accountable to the present version of your life. If everything important is always arriving later, then the person never has to fully meet what is here now. The death of the spiritual identity returns the path to the present tense. The present tense is where the identity has the least room to perform. You cannot hide behind future awakening when the moment asks you to be honest. You cannot hide behind cosmic mission when the relationship asks you to listen. You cannot hide behind being empathetic when your own behavior needs repair. You cannot hide behind being misunderstood when you have not clearly communicated. The present tense strips spirituality down to its living truth. And that stripping can feel humbling because it removes the grandeur that once softened the demand. But this humility is not meant to make life smaller. It makes life more real. A person who no longer needs to perform depth can finally experience depth without tension. A person who no longer needs to prove they are guided can respond to guidance without turning it into identity. A person who no longer needs to be spiritually impressive can become far more trustworthy because their presence is no longer negotiating for status. This is why the death of the spiritual identity often produces a quieter kind of authority. That authority does not come from titles, claims, or the ability to speak an elevated language. It comes from congruence. The person begins to feel the same in public and in private. Their words become less inflated and more accurate. Their service becomes less dramatic and more consistent. Their sensitivity becomes less fragile and more useful. Their path stops being something they display and becomes something they live through ordinary choices. There is a relief inside this, but the relief arrives slowly because the old identity does not leave without grief. It may feel like losing a private mythology that once helped life make sense. It may feel like laying down a robe you wore through some of your hardest seasons. It may feel like becoming no one after years of believing you were becoming someone sacred. Yet the deeper truth is more generous than that. You are not becoming no one. You are becoming less dependent on being someone. And once that dependence begins to loosen, the sacred is not gone. It is no longer trapped inside the image of the sacred self. It can move through work, silence, conversation, responsibility, correction, rest, and ordinary kindness. It can appear without needing to be named, and it can guide without needing to be turned into proof. This is where the death of the spiritual identity becomes less like losing the path and more like discovering that the path was never asking you to become a symbol. It was asking you to become honest enough that the symbol was no longer required. There comes a point where the spiritual identity can no longer survive by changing its language. It may become quieter, more refined, more humble on the surface, but if the center is still trying to be somebody through spirituality, the same structure remains. A person can stop calling themselves chosen and still secretly need to feel uniquely selected. They can stop calling themselves a healer and still organize their worth around being needed. They can stop calling themselves awakened and still protect the belief that they see what others cannot. This is why the death of the spiritual identity has to move deeper than vocabulary. It is not enough to stop using certain words if the inner posture remains untouched. The issue is not the label itself, but the need beneath the label. Every identity survives through a need it promises to satisfy. The spiritual identity often promises significance, protection, clarity, belonging, or escape from ordinary pain. When that promise is exposed, the path becomes less about what a person believes and more about what they are using belief to avoid. A person may discover that spirituality was helping them stay above certain human truths. It gave them beautiful language for pain, but sometimes kept them from feeling the simpler grief underneath. It gave them a map of purpose, but sometimes protected them from disappointment. It gave them a sense of mission, but sometimes helped them avoid the fear of being ordinary. None of this means the path was false. It means the path was being mixed with survival, and survival always tries to turn truth into security. This recognition can feel tender because nobody wants to admit that something sacred also carried self-protection. But most human development is mixed in exactly this way. The same practice that opens you can also become a defense. The same teaching that frees you can also become a hiding place. The same identity that helped you survive one season can quietly limit the next one. Spiritual maturity does not require pretending the earlier identity was worthless. It requires seeing when its work is complete. When that completion arrives, the person may feel less interested in announcing their path and more interested in testing its fruit. This is one of the cleanest signs that the identity is dying in a healthy way. The question changes from what does this say about who I am to what does this make possible in how I live. That shift sounds small, but it changes everything. It moves spirituality from image to consequence, from self description to embodied pattern, from specialness to responsibility. You begin to notice that truth has weight only when it changes behavior. A belief that never alters your choices is often just decoration. An insight that never reaches your relationships remains partly unintegrated. A spiritual experience that makes you feel expanded but leaves your conduct untouched has not yet finished descending into life. This is where the death of the spiritual identity becomes a gift, because it removes the ability to keep admiring your own depth while postponing its demands. This is also where the path becomes more intimate. Without the spiritual identity constantly mediating experience, ordinary moments begin carrying more instruction. A difficult conversation can reveal more than a dramatic sign. A repeated habit can teach more than a vision. A simple apology can become more transformative than another explanation of healing. The sacred does not become less real. It becomes less dependent on dramatic packaging. That is difficult for the old identity because it preferred elevation. It wanted the path to feel high, charged, unmistakable, and clearly separate from ordinary life. But real integration often feels grounded, repetitive, and almost plain. It asks you to be honest when nobody is impressed. It asks you to practice presence when there is no audience. It asks you to return to the same truth until your life finally matches it. The ego may call this boring because it cannot feed on it as easily. Yet what looks boring to the spiritual ego can be deeply alive to the soul. Keeping your word can become a spiritual act. Not manipulating a conversation can become a spiritual act. Letting someone have their own process without trying to control it can become a spiritual act. Resting before collapse, telling the truth before resentment forms, listening without preparing a teaching, admitting when you were wrong. These are not lesser forms of practice. They are often where the practice becomes real. The death of the spiritual identity also changes how a person handles mystery. Earlier, mystery may have been used to feel special, as if not being understood proved depth. Later, mystery becomes something quieter and cleaner. You no longer need every hidden thing to become part of your identity. You can allow the unknown to remain unknown without turning it into a personal mythology. This does not reduce wonder. It makes wonder less possessive. That shift protects a person from turning every experience into confirmation. Not every dream is a mandate. Not every coincidence is an assignment. Not every intense feeling is intuition. Not every resistance from others means they are unable to receive your light. Sometimes a dream is emotional processing. A coincidence is a coincidence. An intense feeling is a nervous system response. And resistance from others is feedback you need to hear. The spiritual identity resists these possibilities because they make life less centered around its story. But the mature path can hold them without losing depth. It can admit that some things are ordinary and still sense meaning where meaning is real. It can accept correction without collapsing into shame. It can recognize intuition without making every impulse sacred. It can honor unseen guidance without using unseen guidance to bypass accountability. This balance is not less spiritual. It is spirituality becoming strong enough to survive reality. One of the most powerful consequences of this death is that the person becomes more teachable. The spiritual identity often hides how unteachable it has become. It may speak of openness while filtering every challenge through the belief that it already understands. It may say it values truth while only accepting truth that confirms its self-image. When that identity loosens, the person can receive correction from unexpected places. They can learn from people who do not speak their language, share their beliefs, or recognize their path. This is a major expansion because wisdom was never confined to the identity that claimed it. A child can reveal impatience in you. A coworker can expose pride. A skeptic can help refine your clarity. A mundane responsibility can show you where your spirituality lacks discipline. Once the identity dies, life itself becomes less divided into sacred and unsacred sources. Everything that reveals truth becomes part of the teaching field, even when it arrives without spiritual packaging. The same change affects service. A person no longer needs to help in order to prove they are helpful. They no longer need to guide in order to prove they are wise. They no longer need to heal in order to prove they are loving. This makes their service less needy and more accurate. They can act when action is clean, stay silent when silence is cleaner, and allow others to meet themselves without turning every struggle into an opportunity to perform care. This cleaner service may look smaller, but it is often more trustworthy. It does not flood the room with unsolicited insight. It does not make another person's pain into a stage. It does not use compassion to create dependence. It can sit beside someone without needing to fix them. It can speak when speech serves, and it can withdraw when involvement would secretly feed the helper's identity. This is love with fewer hooks in it. There is also a freedom in not needing to be spiritually understood. That freedom is hard-earned because many people use spiritual identity to soothe the loneliness of being different. They wanted someone to see the depth, the origin, the purpose, the burden, the subtle perception. There's nothing wrong with wanting to be understood. But if the need to be understood becomes the center, the person may spend life trying to get others to validate a self that is meant to dissolve. When the spiritual identity dies, understanding becomes beautiful when it happens, but no longer required for integrity. From there, a quieter life begins to open. Not necessarily smaller and not necessarily less visionary, but less burdened by constant self-definition. You can speak of spiritual things without needing to become the spiritual one. You can carry unusual experiences without organizing your entire personality around them. You can serve without becoming trapped in the helper role. You can be guided without needing guidance to make you superior. The sacred remains, but the self built around owning the sacred becomes less necessary. This is where the fear of nihilism loses power. Meaning does not disappear when the spiritual identity dies. What disappears is the pressure to make meaning dramatic enough to protect the ego. The person discovers that life can be meaningful without being inflated. Purpose can be real without being theatrical. Guidance can be present without being announced. Depth can exist without display. And once that is known, the path begins to breathe in a way it could not breathe while wearing the costume of itself. So the death of the spiritual identity does not end the journey. It removes the part of the journey that needed to keep looking at itself while walking. It allows the seeker to become sincere, the healer to become clean, the chosen one to become human, and the human to become more available to what is actually true. What comes after this is not the absence of spirituality, but a spirituality no longer trapped inside spiritual self-image. And once that begins to happen, the next identity waiting beneath the surface becomes easier to see, because every role that dies reveals another role that had been quietly using it for cover.
If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Vaharat library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.